Hi, Anthony and Bob Barker here, and today we're going to go over how we made these patio chairs. Let's get started.
So to get started here, we're breaking down these 4x4s. Now these are kiln-dried lumber, which I found out was pretty darn important for this particular project because I initially got a 3x4 that wasn't kiln-dried, and once I cut it down to size, it just cracked all over the place and just didn't look good. So what I'm trying to do here is make sure that I break down all the parts of my leg from one individual 4x4. That way the colors and the sizing matches better because there can be some slight variations from the lumber that you do get at the lumber yard. And using a stop block is very useful in making these kind of cuts because it's going to keep all your sizing very consistent, and you definitely want consistency when it's coming to this type of a build. Another thing that I did want to mention is each time that I'm cutting these pieces down, I'm labeling all of them. That way I know exactly where they're going to go. So after we get them cut, now I'm going to cut it down to a 3x4 because I just wanted a little bit of a thinner profile, a little bit of less chunky wood. So I'm basically just raised the blade to about half the height of this 4x4 and then ran it through one way, flipped it over to the other side, and then run it through again, and that'll get me the size that I'm looking for. And once we have all those cut out, the next part is to put a bevel on there. So I put an angle on my blade here, and then I ran each one of the pieces through there. And that kind of takes down the thickness of it and gives it a nice contour on all of the legs here. And I am keeping some of these scrap pieces because I'm going to get some uses out of them later on in this build. So after we get these all shaped up, the next is to put the miter on there. Definitely don't want to use a butt joint with this type of bevel on there because it just won't look right. So this is the best way to put these pieces together. And while you're making these cuts, you want to be very careful to make sure that you're doing them in the right direction so they all fit together the way you want them to. And to get the right angle, since I don't trust the factory presets, I used a digital angle finder when I set this up. So since these are going to be miter joints, I wanted to find a way to get these a little bit stronger joint. So I ended up using this beadlock system here, and it turned out pretty well. So I marked a center line where I wanted that to go. Then you basically clamp this jig to it, and then you have a drill that goes through on the jig itself, and then after you do the initial 2 holes, then you're going to go ahead and switch this from the A to the B configuration, and then you're going to do a 3rd hole. And that's going to make all the holes overlap each other, so then you have the single tenon that goes through it. And you want to make sure you clamp this down really well so it doesn't move. It's a little bit more tricky on this miter joint, but it still worked out good. So then after you get that all nice and cleaned out, you can see the tenon fits in nice and snug. So then we just go ahead and repeat that on all the legs. That way we can get ready to glue them up afterwards. And when we do glue them up, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get good pressure on these joints while it dries. So for that, we're going to just be making some culls here. So I got some of the scrap pieces of wood that I kept earlier, along with this little wedge that I cut off, and just used some CA glue to put that together. And I'm going to be doing one on each side of each joint that I'm doing. I only have enough clamps to do one joint at a time, so I only needed 2 of these. But if you got more clamps, and more would be useful. So once we have those together, you can see that's going to go on the sides of those joints there, and then we can clamp that up, and that will keep good pressure on it while it's drying. Now, of course, you don't have to use this particular method to strengthen this joint. You could even just use dowels. If you do that, I would just make sure you're very careful with your measurements to get them lined up properly. And of course, if you have something like a domino, then that's even easier. So now we just get glue all over the place on the tenon and the joint itself, and then we're going to go ahead and get this joint together. Now most of my joints did come together pretty darn smoothly, but some of them were just slightly off, but nothing was off enough where a little sanding didn't take care of it. And you can see here how these culls make a nice and easy way to get good clamping pressure on these joints. So after we get both of our legs put together, now it's time to get started on the rest of it. So we chopped down a whole bunch of 2x3 lumber here, as well as some 1x4s that we're going to be using for the slats. So of course the miter station is super handy for this, and the stop block is definitely useful to make sure everything is nice uniform measurements, and so it'll come together so much smoother. And I did end up using Douglas fir for this, even though it's not the most ideal one. It's going to be in a covered patio, and the cost of the weather resistant hardwoods that I would have preferred is just way too expensive still. So next up on the list is we're going to get the seat frame put together, and that's what we're doing here. And I'm using some pocket holes on the inside to make sure everything stays hidden. And then I still am using a water resistant glue as well as exterior rated screws to put it all together. So I'm still using my clamps to keep this together when I'm doing the pocket hole screws. I tried that other clamp that you can see on the table there, but it just still kept on moving at me. I don't know what I was doing wrong with that. So I just went back to my bigger clamps. I know it's not going to move when I use those. And as I finish putting this piece together, once I get it all screwed in place, I always check it with a square just to make sure I don't have to make any other adjustments with it. So then I grabbed some of the scraps here and I just cut out some lines, and for the first time I just did this way. I just measured the depth of the slats that I'm going to use and just put a line on there. This actually was a harder way to do that. I should have just flipped it upside down and just had the slats in there and just set the wood on top of it, but this still worked in the end. Now, this is underneath, so you'll never see it, and the scraps that I had when I made the first one wasn't quite long enough, so I ended up putting 2 pieces in each side. On the second chair that I made, I ended up doing 1 continuous piece, and it was easier that way. So after we get both of those supports on, it's time to get the slats in place. And so what I did for these ones is I just got some spacers, and then we just kind of put the slats in place. And of course, it's a nice snug fit since we cut everything else out at this miter station at the same time using those stop blocks. So I just go ahead and clamp those down and then put some screws in through those bottom supports to keep those in place so you'll never see those screws. And I do want to mention that if you like this build, we are going to have detailed plans available with step-by-step directions, 3D modeled images, and as well as I am fixing all the little issues I ran into on this one so you don't have to run into the same problems if you make it. So after we get all those slats on, there is a little space here on top. And what I'm going to do for that one, I'm just cutting off a little slice of a slat there. But the nice part is once I get this in place, it's going to be covered by the back of the seat, so you'll never actually see it. And of course, we secure that one just the same way as we did the rest of the slats. And then the bottom seat is done. So next up, we're going to be making the seat back, and we're putting this together a similar way. I'm using pocket hole screws, and I'm doing it on the underside of both the bottom and of the top of it to, once again, trying to keep that as hidden as possible so you won't see it when the finished piece is put together. Now, I could have used the beadlocks for this too, but to be honest, there's a little bit of a hassle. They're good to use, but I just really didn't want to use it for all of the joints. So once I got that together, I want to put a little bit of an angle on here. So I just tilted my blade slightly, and then I kind of snuck up on the cut. And of course, I'm very careful of where I place those pocket hole screws so I'm not cutting through the screws when I'm chopping this part down. And it's going to help give just a slight recline in the chair and make it a little bit more comfortable. This shows a different way to put on those supports. For this one, I just kind of wedged in a couple of the slats, and then I can put this next to it, and then for the seat back, I only want to temporarily put those on because they're going to need to be off once we're assembling it. So first I glued it up, and then you can see how it covers up that back slat as I put it there. So I'm temporarily clamping it into place here, and then we're going to put some big screws from underneath into the back there, and that'll help fully secure it. So for these ones, I'm going through the middle section, but after we get that done, we're going to flip it up on its side. And then drill some holes that go even deeper into those vertical supports. And of course on here, I'm being careful to avoid where the pocket holes are, so I'm not drilling into the metal screws. And of course, I'm preferring just to screw everything from underneath because I'm trying to keep as many of these screws hidden as possible so you have a nice clean look on the chair when it's done. So after I got that part done, I just put a small round over on all the edges just to make sure everything is nice and smooth to the touch. And we then go ahead and do the same thing on the legs as well. And I ran all the way around the inside of it too, but of course the router bit doesn't get into the tiny corners. So for that, I just did a little bit of hand kind of sanding and shaping just to kind of get that evened out. Next, we're going to be doing some supports for the front and the back of the chair that are going to connect between the legs. And for these ones, we are using the beadlocks again, so we're doing that in the same way. And it's much easier to clamp it to this flat surface than it was to the miter surface. And then we're going to do corresponding beadlock holes over here on the legs as well. And it's very important to measure those exactly where you want them. And the first time I did it, my measurements were not quite how I wanted it, so I had to fix it a little bit. So it wasn't set back enough in the front, so then I just go ahead and trim off a little bit of this support, and that helped to give it the setback that I was looking for. And then here I'm putting an angle on the top, and that's going to give a little bit of extra recline once I put the seat on top of it. So now it's time to get these put together. So I'm putting a whole bunch of glue, and of course Bob Barker is there in the background making sure that I'm doing this right. And for these ones, luckily my clamps were just big enough to reach the span of these legs, so we can just go ahead and kind of shove this all together, and then I could put my F clamps on there. Then we just switch off to the back side and do the same thing. And just like before, we're using the water resistant glue, just because this is an outside project, even though, like I said, it's going to be on a covered patio. So this was a nice snug fit to get the chair in there. So I basically set it on that front support, and then I use a couple clamps on the back to get it right about where I want it. And I did pre-measure, so I knew exactly where it was supposed to go, so that I can kind of get it adjusted into place. And to secure it, I jumped underneath the chair, and I'm screwing through that front support into the frame of the seat. And so that's going to make sure it never moves anywhere. So for some reason, I started off laying on here up until the point that I realized, oh, I can just stand in front of it on the edge of my workbench and do it easier that way. So then after we have that part secured, I'm going back to the back, and I'm using my digital angle finder just to make sure I had the recline that I was looking for. And once I was happy with that, then it's on to securing this, and we're using some lag screws for that. So first I use a Forstner bit to make sure that I sink the head of the lag screw in deep enough, and then pre-drill it all the way through into the arm support there. And this also shows why I couldn't keep those supports for the slats in place, because these lag bolts had to go right where those were. So that gets it nice and tight, where that's going to hold it good and secure on each side. So that's going to give extra support for the chair itself, since the back is kind of a floating back. So once that's done, we're on to putting on the rest of the back slats. And so now we're getting the supports back into place, and like before, I kind of wedge those in place and then just kind of clamp them, and then we can go ahead and screw them into place. Now these screws right here, those four are the only ones that are kind of visible on the chair once it's done, but since they're kind of facing inward in the back, you don't really see them. And for the slats here, we're going to go ahead and do those the same way as we did before, just using the spacers. And then I'm putting an extra support right behind the seat, and I'm gonna use some pocket hole screws from the front to secure that, so you'll never see those pocket holes as well. And that's just gonna give a little extra support to the back here, just more so it doesn't move, and it also helps lock in another point of contact for the legs. And then we continue to go down, and I didn't measure right on this one. Of course I fixed this on my plans. So just to get that space a little bit smaller and in line with the other ones, I cut off a little strip, and then we kind of glue it right there into place. Now to cover all these screws that you can see in the back here, I just cut off a small little strip, and we're gluing that onto there. So it covers like the majority of the screws. Like I said, those inside ones you'll still be able to see, but those ones is kind of no big deal. But I did want to get the bigger part done. So then one of the end parts here, I wanted to put on some leg levelers because I just didn't want the wood to be resting straight on the ground. So I used same thing as I did with the lag screws, the Forstner bit, and then drilled through, and then we pound in the T-nut into place, and I didn't have anything better, so I ended up just using the leveler itself to pound it. But once it gets in, you kind of screw it in, and that's going to keep it just off the ground. So next up, the wife wanted a bit of a stain on here, so I just used a tack cloth after I sanded the heck out of everything to get all the dust off, and then we're going to go ahead and just apply some of the stain on here. And for this one, we wanted to do just a slight stain, so we didn't want to get too crazy with the color, still kind of feel a little natural. So after we get all the stain on there, then I went ahead and put some Spar urethane finish on there. I ended up doing about like 3 coats on there. And it gives it a little extra protection for the outside environment. And of course, the supervisor wanted to remind me that he wanted me to get the bottom of the chairs done as well. So under his watchful eye, I made sure I finished the project to his satisfaction.
All right, and the projects are done. We're super happy with how these came out, and more importantly, Bob Barker finds them quite comfortable to lounge on. So if you do want to make these yourselves, check out the description below. We have detailed plans available. You'll find the link there for it. And just to let you guys know, we're going to be making a full set out of this. So we'll have a coffee table as well as a sofa and probably some end tables too. So if you like the videos and the projects we've been putting out, it's a great help if you like the videos, subscribe to the channel, or even just leave a comment below telling us what you think of them. All right, so we'll see you guys in the next one.